If you go to the Valley, like it's something like 70% of the sort of investors at the best venture funds have been founders and operators. So a lot of the best founders that we know went to Silicon Valley when they needed to get that access to that kind of expertise. And so I think Europe in general just needs more kind of founders and operators to sort of play this kind of mentoring and investing role.
Welcome back to 40-Minute Mentor, the podcast on a mission to raise aspirations and inspire the next generation of category-defining founders, all in just 40 minutes. In today's replay episode, you'll hear from Ian Hogarth, CBE, who is the co-founder and former CEO of Songkick, a partner at the VC firm Plural, and chair of the UK AI Safety Institute, reporting directly into the Prime Minister. In this episode, Ian shares his journey from building Songkick, one of the world's most beloved live music platforms, and also more about his work at Plural, where he supports the next wave of impactful founders. He also offers fascinating insights into the intersection of tech and society, the importance of ethical innovation, and his experience as an investor backing visionary startups. I can't wait for you to listen to this episode, so please do sit back, relax, and enjoy the next fantastic 40 minutes with the brilliant Ian Hogarth. Ian, a big welcome to the 40-Minute Mentor. Thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Yeah, great, thank you.
Oh, good stuff. Well, we're going to kick off as we always do with some quick fire questions just to warm you up. So please finish the following sentences after me. My first ever job was
working for a year before university, writing software for touchscreens.
Oh, amazing. That's a great first job. I don't think many of our founders have actually started with that job. How did you get into that in the first place?
I mean, it's kind of, I suppose it's skipping a paper round and things like that. But yeah, I applied for a sort of apprenticeship scheme at an organization called Cambridge Consultants. And they basically sponsored me through university, worked for them for 10 months prior to university. And they sort of taught me the sort of fundamentals of software programming as part of that apprenticeship.
Oh, brilliant route to uni as well to get that sponsored as well. That's amazing. And I guess explains a lot of the kind of future path of your career. So looking forward to digging into that more. Brilliance to me means
people who follow their own path with energy and integrity.
I love that. And I'm assuming you look for founders with those sorts of qualities as well nowadays. So yeah, looking forward to discussing further. A misconception people about me have is,
I'm not sure it's exactly a misconception, but I'm quite private about my family life. You know, after my son was born, I really reoriented my professional life around being a father to him. So, I took equal parental leave. I sort of organized my working day very much so I can spend as much time with him as possible and put his needs first in many cases. So I would say there's kind of what a joy it's been to be a dad and how much that's changed the way I work.
Oh, I love that answer. Yeah, I mean, the best thing that ever happened to me was being a dad almost 7 years ago. Sadly, it took me the pandemic to kind of properly reorient my lifestyle and change sort of not having to commute every day and those sorts of things. But I've never really looked back since. And I'm sure a lot of people will be grateful for hearing that, because I think it's, it is doable in this day and age to do things like shared parental leave, isn't it? And I think it's something that we're seeing more and more execs doing. And finally, can you share something we wouldn't learn from your CV that could be a failure or setback in your career that you've learned a lot from?
I think a funny one was, I studied engineering at university and I specialized in machine learning back in 2005. And I also studied Mandarin Chinese in 2000 and 2003 and 2005. And I had this quite clear plan of wanting to start an AI company in China. And my life was very much building towards that. I was working on my Mandarin, I was working on machine learning. And then I kind of realized within about a year of trying to do that it was just a terrible idea. Like, it was challenging to start a new business in China as a foreigner. And back in 2005, 6 when I was trying to do it, it was also just like not prime time for machine learning. There wasn't really much you could actually build in 2005. And so, it was kind of a big vision I had that I've been building towards for maybe 5 years at that point, that sort of just, I had to take a different path.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that. That's really interesting. And I guess you ultimately went on to become a very successful entrepreneur. But you mentioned you started your career as a software engineer, and clearly you did that through university, and then became a consultant at Bain and Co. before starting Songkick. So do you mind telling our listeners just a little bit more about that early career for you and what ultimately led you to starting Songkick?
Yeah, I think I got really lucky in that my grandfather was an engineer, and he had a really kind of lovely thing he did with his retirement where he would basically, he was part of a charity called Remap. And the core idea was he'd basically get connected with people with some kind of disability that was inhibiting them doing some day-to-day actions that they really valued. And he would go to sort of consult with them, sit with them, and then basically build a little contraption that enabled them to do the thing they weren't able to do. And I would kind of follow him around doing that. And so I kind of got a real feeling for the pleasure of inventing new things from him. And he had a workshop where he had a small wooden lathe. We'd make things together. So he really loved making things. And so I think I got introduced relatively young to the pleasure of making something. And then I got really lucky in that both at school and at university, I got the chance to make things of my own. And so I made quite a specific style of bike light at university when I was 16. And I found this like incredible amount of energy came out. And I just remember working so hard, and it felt effortless to work hard. All I wanted to do was work on this bike light. And then at university, I got to make my first robot. And again, all I wanted to do was work. I would want to be in the lab basically constantly trying to work on the software and make the robot do different things. And I realized that making something new where I could kind of see the whole thing and had a sort of vision for the whole thing was just it catalyzed me like nothing else. And I felt so alive, so motivated, and it felt really effortless. I felt like I could basically work hard without having to really apply any sort of willpower or anything like that. And so I knew that I wanted to make something. Like I knew that was really like the thing for me. And I also, my dad was an entrepreneur. And so I saw that, and I sort of thought the way I probably would do it by starting something. My dad was really wonderful. I wasn't at Bain very long. I was there about 9 months. And then I had the idea for Songkick, and I called him up and I basically said, look, I'm thinking about quitting my job and just starting this company. And I knew that basically, but pretty much anyone else in my life I called, they probably tried to tell me not to, but my dad just said, go for it. And so I think there are lots of aspects of kind of luck along the way, but I'd say I was clear that I loved making things. And then I got lucky in that my dad and my grandfather both kind of showed me different sides of that. My dad showed me kind of how to do something, sort of plunge out on your own. And my granddad showed me how to sort of make stuff.
Love that. What an interesting story. And for those that listening to this that haven't heard of Songkick, I'll be surprised if that's the case. But those that haven't, can you tell them a little bit about what Songkick is and sort of the early story of how that kind of came to be?
Yeah. So Songkick was and is an application for discovering concerts. So we look at the music you listen to. We have the largest database of kind of concert listings in the world. And then Songkick will basically scan your music taste, the bands you've been listening to, scan all the concerts happening, and then proactively alert you when any of them announce concerts and help you buy tickets. So it sort of takes all the effort out of finding concerts to go to. And, someone who uses Songkick sort of goes to roughly twice as many concerts after they start using the app, because it just becomes so much easier to find stuff to go to. And going back to kind of how I got started, I was living in Singapore working for Bain, and I basically took the job at Bain because I wanted to spend time in China with this plan of starting this AI company. I thought I probably ought to learn about business and things like that. And then I had this really weird sort of detour where Bain basically said, look, we know you've moved your whole life out to Singapore, but we'd like you to now move to California to go and, help out on this technology company. And I was really against that, because my whole plan was to basically base my life in China. And I was quite annoyed. And, I ended up working out, surprisingly well, because the time that they moved me to California, they moved me to the Bay Area in 2006, just when sort of things were, I think there's a new wave of energy coming into Silicon Valley. And a friend of mine, Alex, he connected with a friend of his called Jeff Hammerbacher. And Jeff was the head of data science at Facebook. And he really kind of was just became a great friend and, kind of a mentor in many ways to this day. And I saw what Jeff was doing, which is building out these really amazing sort of data science systems at Facebook in 2006. And he had the same academic background as me, the same kind of intellectual interests. And I just thought, that's what I should be doing. You can do something right now. And so I quit my job after I basically then started to try and find the first good idea, and that was Songkick, and it was somewhat Michelle's idea actually rather than mine. But as soon as I kind of, as soon as we found something good, I kind of want to just get on with it and start up. And I think meeting Jeff and seeing how, someone who was sort of 24 was doing something really inspiring and really cool, just kind of like tipped me into doing it sooner than I might have done otherwise.
Amazing. What a great time to be in the Bay Area and to come up with such a topic that kind of caught you all, sort of sparked that inspiration. And you clearly obviously built it into, a hugely recognizable and incredibly successful business. You led the company as CEO for 8 years and achieved so many incredible milestones. And that's, I guess, particularly impressive given that you were a first-time founder at the time. So learning on the job must have been particularly challenging. Were there any things that really helped you get up the learning curve quicker in that time? And particularly given that you were relatively young and inexperienced?
I think the first thing that really helped was Y Combinator. So we were the second British team to get into Y Combinator, and it was just such a shock to the system because I would say Pete, Michelle, and I, the co-founders of Songkick, we were quite feral entrepreneurs. Like we didn't really know what we were doing. And like, I remember someone telling me about VCs, and I just said, what is a VC? And it wasn't startup culture in the UK. There were very few startups, and there wasn't as much of a sort of internet culture around it. And so I found Paul Graham's essays and kind of went down that rabbit hole, got into YC. And so then we sort of got a bit of a shock to the system. And I remember stuff like talking to, I think it was Trevor Blackwell, one of the partners, and he said, I think you should raise some investment for your startup. And I remember just sort of saying like, well, how much do you think we should raise? And I think we were like living so cheaply and trying to, because we'd started the business on our savings from our first jobs. And I remember him saying, oh, you should maybe think about raising $1 million. And I just like burst out laughing because I was like, dude, what are we going to do with all that? Like we're like spending like, like £1,000 a month. Like where do you, and obviously then you fast forward and I kind of see how that you do suddenly spend money because you hire people and go faster, etc. But I'd say Y Combinator was one big thing. And then the other one was really active mentors and more experienced people around me. So one person who I remember really helping me a lot was an angel investor called Peter Reed. And he was in many ways, so when I became an angel investor, I sort of based a lot of what I was doing around how it felt to work with him. And he was just a really lovely, wonderful guy who spent hours and hours with me on my first sort of institutional fundraise, our Series A, basically helping me interpret what the hell the VCs meant, negotiating terms, playing the VCs off against each other. And I remember at one point, even one of the VCs got quite pissed off with me and sort of said, oh, like, you're like, you need to just agree these terms, or just they were being quite aggressive. And I remember one of the angel investors we had was a bit scared off by that because I don't think he wanted to keep his relationship with the VC sweet. And Peter was like, basically like, look, I don't give a shit. I'll happily like damage that relationship if it helps you get the right outcome here. So I think having somebody who, it wasn't like he gave me this one piece of advice and then walked away. He was just on the phone with me like every day for like 2 weeks as I worked through this. So that was really helpful. And then I think we brought in some early team members, people like a guy called Gideon Bullock, who he joined us from Skype, and he sort of led designing the kind of, he was technically our creative director, but he basically led all the design. And he just brought so much maturity into the business in terms of how you do product development and how you build things. And then our CTO, Dan Crow, he joined us from Apple and Google, and he brought quite a lot of experience in terms of sort of scaling and sort of managing an engineering team. So they were a couple of examples of people inside the business who really helped me and I got to learn from. So yeah, I think basically finding people who had a bunch of knowledge that I didn't have that I could then benefit from.
Yeah, that's such a great answer. And I think we find some of the very best founders and CEOs out there are able to sort of attract and retain exceptional talent, particularly at that leadership level. And you clearly made some really strong early hires. Were there any other particular lessons, particularly around that kind of hiring point, and especially for any founders that might be listening to this that might be at that similar sort of stage in the journey? What advice would you have for them that are looking to build a world-class senior team?
I mean, I think some general advice is getting other people to help you calibrate. So I'm just thinking about a couple of the startups that I work with really closely. I've ended up interviewing probably 80% of the kind of key early hires they've made alongside the founder. And I've just been able to give them a point of view on the people they're looking at and trying to, it's not so much calibrating on whether someone's talented or not, because usually the founder's kind of capable of doing that. But it's more like, do they really fit with where the holes are in this organization at this stage? And like, it's quite a nuanced thing of just trying to work out like, how are these people to come together, and will there be a really catalyzing effect on the organization if you bring this person in. So I think that's a general thing you can do. And, you should find sort of mentors and advisors and investors who can kind of play that role, I'd say. Personally, I think I've always been really drawn to people who challenge me. I think I'm probably the opposite of someone who likes yes men. I'm almost quite skeptical of anyone who isn't willing to sort of tell me when I'm wrong. And so if I'm playing a competitive game or like chess or something, I always want to play against someone better than me. And I really enjoy the feeling of being challenged by someone. And so I think I've always been drawn to and good at identifying people who will kind of stretch me, or there's going to be a healthy tension between the things we know and the way we can kind of co-evolve together as sort of people. So I've always seen it as a really wonderful thing when you can work with someone who you really learn from. One thing I have observed the very best people in this area do is they're sort of almost constantly maintaining a database in their head of people they'd love to hire. There's a founder called Kieran O'Neill who runs a business called Thread. And I would say Kieran is really one of the very best people I know at hiring, and has hired so many good people over the years. I think he has whenever I say to him, "Oh, Kieran, I'm looking to help this startup find this person," he'll always have 5 or 6 people he's been tracking for years who, at some point he's going to go and try and hire one of them. So I think he's kind of the example of it taken to the absolute extreme, because he's just so proactive in thinking about it before he even has a hole in the organization to be filled. The other thing I'd say is, I didn't do this that well as a founder, but I think part of the other side of that is I really don't believe it's a good thing to have sort of people who can't be replaced, including yourself. I think it's actually a healthy organization is one where no individual has too much leverage on the organization and can kind of dictate how they want things to be, because the organization depends on them too much. It's just lack of resiliency. And so I think one way to minimize politics as an organization is to sort of really try to set things up in such a way where everyone, including yourself, is replaceable, and you're all actually really there in service of the mission, and there's no ability for kind of ego to run out ahead of the organization.
Yeah, that's such good advice. And I really love that point around that, having an eye on the market, it's much further ahead in terms of talent, because I think sometimes founders can be very reactive to, oh God, we need to get someone at the door quickly. Whereas if you're consistently looking for great talent, even if you can't hire them instantly, just building that relationship over the long term, I think you can get really ahead of the competition.
The other thing about talent that is really quite mysterious and amazing is if you've got an organization with, let's say, I'm just going to make this up, there's 3 founders, they all bring a lot to the table, but then there's just this other person who enters the building who just brings something magical that is not yet there in the founding team. The business can suddenly do things it just couldn't do before. It can be a different thing. And there's this amazing way in which talent can actually catalyze the ambition level being raised, the potential suddenly going up. And suddenly, you thought you were dealing with a company that was going to do X, and suddenly it can do something quite substantially more. And so I think of talent as extremely catalytic. It's not so much just oh yeah, we've got some holes and we need to fill them and we need to check these boxes. It's also really, really, really amazing people can kind of catalyze the actual entire scope and mission of the business expanding.
100%. No, that's so true. Thank you so much, Ian. It's really interesting talking about that, because you've built multiple teams, and we'll come on to talk about Plural, where I guess you'll be backing some of the best talent in Europe. But before we come to that, it would be remiss of me not to mention some of the harder parts of the journey at Songkick. I know that you, during your tenure as CEO, you had an antitrust battle with Ticketmaster, which was settled out of court for $130 million. Can you share just a bit about that experience and how you got through it, particularly stressful time, I'd imagine? And then we'd also just love to learn a bit about kind of when you knew it was the right time to sort of step away from Songkick, which is, again, another challenging thing to do as a founder.
I'll answer the second question first. I'd say, by far and away the hardest time, during Songkick was that my sister was diagnosed with a terminal form of cancer and passed away. And
I'm so sorry.
Running a startup at the best of time takes a lot out of you, and it depletes your kind of resiliency over time. And I'm sort of proud of the fact that even while that was happening, I was able to support my family, and I was able to continue being a good CEO to the business and navigate the business to a kind of to sort of good outcome, or the best outcome available to the business. But once I'd sort of done that, I basically completed this merger and kind of set us down the path of the lawsuit and various other things. I kind of knew, I basically just had no time to grieve and to deal with this, this enormous trauma in my life. And so it was clear to me I just needed to, it was the right time where I could sort of step away with kind of confidence. I'd sort of done my best by both the company and my family, and it was time to sort of grieve, to have time for myself. In terms of the question about the lawsuit and sort of other hard times, I mean, I think in some ways the lawsuit was just a bit of a kind of, maybe the entire company really was building up to that over the course of it, because the core of Songkick is we just picked one of the most monopolized markets on earth. So Ticketmaster, Live Nation are two businesses that were allowed to merge by the US kind of government in a period when they were taking a very, very lax approach to antitrust and allowing a lot of kind of very large company mergers to occur. But, you basically had a Ticketmaster with, let's say, 60-70% of primary ticketing market share in North America. Live Nation, which probably has, for the sake of argument, the same kind of percentage of concert promotion. Live Nation, subsequently to the merger, built the world's largest artist management company. They ended up launching their own secondary ticketing offering, which is now, I think, probably the second largest in the world. They have the largest global festival business. And there's just these, a lot of the rights they have are multi-decade rights. Their rights over tickets at a venue for, let's say, a decade. And so you have a market that is just so unbelievably controlled by a single organization. And that just creates so much challenge for innovation, because it's just much harder to do new things when one company kind of controls the market so substantially. And so we did our best to find a way through that. And I really feel like I was kind of like a dog with a bone, trying to find the angle where you could build something new and better for fans and artists that was allowed to compete in that landscape. And we tried really, really hard. And we ultimately, I think, were doing some really amazing things. I mean, the tour we ticketed with Adele, there were some amazing things we launched during that process, like the ability to block scalpers at the onsale. And we had, Adele's global tour was one of the largest tours in the entire world, probably of the decade, and yet it had the lowest percentage of tickets being scalped that anyone ever seen on such a large tour, all through new technology, right? So that's the benefit of innovation, but it's much, much harder to bring innovation to market in a, heavily monopolized market. And so in the end, we had to file an antitrust suit because of some of the things that Live Nation Ticketmaster did, that eventually the US government fined them, I think, $10 million for various counts of computer hacking and things like that. So I think it was kind of one of these things where we didn't want to file antitrust suit, but we sort of didn't really have an option eventually due to their activities. So I don't know, I think like looking back on it all, I would just say I'm so sensitive to market dynamics. And, I think it's obviously it'd be a real shame if people were scared off trying to innovate in markets because of monopolies. We need brave people to do that, but it requires, I think, a higher level of experience to pull it off than maybe a first-time founder. Like if you look at the music industry in general, there've been so many talented people who've had a go at doing something in it, and probably one of the few and only successful examples was Daniel Ek and Spotify, and the founders there were second-time founders and had a lot more experience than I did when I started Songkick.
And what an amazing story, and I think made all the more incredible getting through that difficult period, given your personal sort of grief at the time. I mean, that's something no one should go through. So, I mean, huge kudos to all you've done, and for standing up against a bigger business trying to sort of effectively bully their way through, which we see far too often. You've obviously spent a number of years sort of since Songkick as a successful angel investor, but you're now back in the founder seat with a very different proposition. So for those that don't know about Plural, can you give our listeners a little bit more info on what the business does and where the inspiration came from?
There were four of us that co-founded Plural: myself, Khaled Helioui, Sten Tamkivi, and Khaled Hinrikus. And the four of us have been founders and operators of European-based startups. And all of us, we're united around three themes that kind of felt important to us. The first was we all kind of talked about what we wished we'd had when we were founders, which was really access to people who'd been in our shoes with that kind of really deep operational experience who could help us navigate some of the challenges as kind of an active sparring partner. The second thing was we'd all been approached by VC funds about kind of joining them, and some great VC funds as well. And for all of us, those places hadn't really felt like a home. They'd felt very hierarchical, quite sort of, sometimes there was a bit of a culture that felt a bit more like the culture of banking rather than the culture of kind of founders and startups. And, not really that sort of peer-to-peer culture that we'd come to sort of know and love as founders. And then the third thing is we all just were really big believers in the importance of Europe having great technology companies, for long-term European sovereignty, for the sort of health of European economies and democracies. And so we sort of said, let's sort of come together and try to find a product that sort of ticks those three boxes. So what Plural is basically it's an investment platform to enable, people we kind of call unemployables to back startups. So unemployables, are these former founders who've spent, a meaningful chunk of their career building a company. And there's this sort of weird thing that happens when you spend a long time as a founder where you kind of become unemployable and not necessarily in a way that is particularly comfortable or nice, but you just become so relentlessly independent that you're just not really going to thrive in a situation where someone's telling you what to do. You sort of really need to do your own thing. And those kind of people don't really fit into traditional venture capital. They're kind of just a bit too independent. And so Plural is a way for those people to give something back and to continue to contribute in a way that is really native to them. And the way that is they find missions they personally deeply believe in, and they commit the funds money and they commit a lot of their time to trying to change the destiny of those missions. So, I'll give you an example. I'm helping a startup that is using advanced machine learning to scalably detect really, really horrible content in online video. And the core idea is to basically make the internet safer by scalably detecting bad content. And I really personally believe in that mission. I'd love to figure out a way to reduce the harms that are perpetrated against, in particular, children through some of these larger online platforms. And this is an exceptional founder who's trying to do this really hard thing. And, I want to basically use a big chunk of the next 5 years of my life to help her succeed. And so it's this kind of taking people like me who've got a really strong independent spirit, but where they actually really also want to contribute to some important missions, and trying to find Plural enables them to do that and to back founders they really believe in and missions they really care about.
I love that. It's so, so important. And the passion really comes across. And I think when Plural was announced, there was lots of press, lots of excitement about it. And I know that, on the surface, some people will see it as a kind of take on a VC model. But can you tell our listeners a bit more about why that isn't the case, and why you feel particularly right now in the ecosystem in Europe, we really need Plural?
So I think that the thing that makes Plural a little bit different, I think, to sort of venture capital as it's kind of often practiced nowadays, is that we are very mission first. So we're basically saying, let's take one of these unemployables and have them basically identify a mission that they are extremely personally compelled by, like to the extent that they would consider joining the company or founding the company. So there's a very high level of intrinsic motivation. And then the time that they will spend with that company is much, much less bounded than a VC fund. So they could spend, say, a day a week with that company if they wanted to really try to change the outcome. And the idea is, if you have that intrinsic motivation for the mission, you're going to just work a lot harder to try to do something and a lot more creatively and with a lot more heart to change the outcome of that business. And so I think that traditionally VC tends to be sort of start with the question of, can this make a lot of money? Whereas we tend to start with the question, do you really care about this mission or not? But when you go back over the history of kind of investing in startups, there are obviously examples of kind of investment entities that did actually do things a bit like that. So I think Y Combinator early on and now, really ultimately was very much focused on, really, really changing the destiny of companies. If you go back to the earliest venture capital, like, Arthur Rock and Fairchild Semiconductor, Arthur Rock, when he invested in Fairchild, it was 6 or 7 incredible physicists, and they basically came to him and said, look, can you help us find a job somewhere? And he said, no, let's start a company and you're going to own it. And we're going to get some external capital for it. And there's going to be an options plan. And he basically, brought this very creative, generative energy to the process that was much less like a financier and much more like a builder and a creator. And so I don't want to sort of spend too much energy arguing whether we are or aren't a VC, but I do think we're trying to do something that is where the core motivation starts somewhere else, which is right. What's something where you really want to make a contribution to the mission? In terms of why Europe needs that, I think that Europe will really benefit from more really hard missions being accomplished here. And I think that part of accomplishing really hard things is having people around you who can tilt the odds in your favor. And I think we should talk a little bit about, for example, I think that companies like Tesla or SpaceX, these really hard companies that tackle like substantial sort of real world challenges, companies based on kind of that aren't just pure software. There aren't very many of those kind of companies created globally, and they tend to be created by people who are on their second or third company. And that's because there's just a lot more founding craft I think you need to kind of have developed to be able to navigate such challenging missions. And even then, they are, there's many times in which both those companies have come close to failure. And so our thinking is for Europe to produce more companies like that have an impact on Europe's energy security, or Europe's ability to defend itself against aggressors, or Europe's ability to innovate fundamentally in healthcare. Those kind of challenges are hard missions. And I think the unemployables at Plural have the potential to really tilt the odds in that founder's favor. I think European venture capital, independent of Plural, also just needs a bit of a reset, because if you look at European venture funds, about 8% of the people leading deals, leading investments have got a founder or operating background. Most of the rest have kind of got a kind of consulting or banking background. And there's just a real cap on how much support and help you can give when you've never actually been a founder yourself. And if you go to the Valley, it's something like 70% of the sort of investors at the best venture funds have been founders and operators. So a lot of the best founders that we know went to Silicon Valley when they needed to get that access to that kind of expertise. And so I think Europe in general just needs more kind of founders and operators to sort of play this kind of mentoring and investing role.
100%. And I guess that's another huge appeal for anyone that's taking investment from Plural will be that you've all been there and done it. You've all got the battle scars, and you can really see how that will make a real tangible difference. There are lots of it's kind of the perfect segue into my next question. Actually, there are so many misconceptions about what the reality of being a founder is. I'm a solo founder, almost 10 years into this journey, and I think a lot of people think you wake up with a great idea and then it's overnight success, and I think that's often completely the opposite is true. So where do you think these misconceptions come from, and why does it take 2 or 3 businesses often for founders to have their very big break?
I think that startups in the sort of classic sense are kind of a relatively new area of the economy. I mean, Fairchild Semiconductor, I'm kind of guessing that was founded maybe, let's say, 70 years ago. And so you've got, that's not very long, right? There's lots of other areas of kind of human life where we've kind of been doing it for a lot longer, whereas building these kind of high growth technology companies that can kind of scale globally is a relatively new thing. And so I think we just haven't yet really come to fully understand how to do it well. I mean, I think that's partly what was so transformational about Y Combinator is they really tried to sort of say, look, startups are much more of a thing than they used to be. They're much cheaper to start. Let's try to come up with some real sort of universal insights in how to build startups. One thing we believe at Plural that it feels to me is really under-discussed is that founding is a kind of craft. Being a great software engineer is a sort of understood craft. Being a great metal worker is a understood craft. Being a brilliant chef is a kind of understood craft. But being a founder is a kind of craft as well. It's the craft of putting together the right team, of identifying the right way to tackle the market, identifying how to kind of set the right culture for the kind of product and organization you're building, understand the pace to move at, and how to capitalize the business, and how to communicate what you're doing to all the various people you're trying to get behind you. And there's just a lot of things you learn along the way where you start to build intuition about how to do things right. In the same way that someone who's amazing at working with, say, analog electronics, they just have a lot of feel for it. There's a mixture of sort of art and science in doing it well. And so I think it's a craft that is not really understood as yet to be a craft. But if you look at many of the iconic technology companies of the last 20 years, you've got, let's say, Netflix, that was not a second-time founder, say, SpaceX, Tesla, Stripe. At that point, they were second-time founders. They'd already spent a couple of years on Automatic, Spotify, Adyen. I could go on, but there's a very long list of these iconic companies that actually weren't started by first-time founders. And that doesn't mean that first-time founders can't build amazing companies. But I think if they can find somebody to be around that business, intimately involved in it, who really cares about the mission and who has got that sort of craft developed, I think they can kind of catalyze the outcome. And, you can see this if you look at the history of other iconic companies with first-time founders. So the role that Sean Parker played at Facebook in the early days in sort of setting that business up in a way where Zuckerberg had the control that meant they didn't sell to Yahoo early on, or kind of cede control to VCs, or the role that Martin Lawrenson played at Spotify in helping to capitalize a business that was really something that a lot of VCs didn't want to invest in at that time, or the role that Mike Markula played at Apple when he sort of helped to mentor Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs through the sort of early, less easy phases of the company before they'd kind of really found something that worked. And so I think that this craft development is just under discussed as an idea. And I think it's just a really important thing to acknowledge, because otherwise you're just kind of, we're not really recognizing what actually has to happen. If you want to become a great founder, you have to kind of learn how to do that.
Yeah, so true. And I guess those points really back up that the whole premise of this podcast, which is around getting the right mentors around you and the right support network. And I guess that's absolutely what Plural is offering any startups that you invest in. For any founders that are listening to this, can you share a little bit more about, how you like to work with founders and what types of companies that you're most, attracted to currently in terms of investment, just so anyone listening can, if they want to approach you?
So I would say I like companies that are trying to do something very hard, usually, at the frontiers of kind of commercializing science or some real frontier of technology. So, I chair a business that is trying to develop the first useful application for a quantum computer, which is called Phasecraft. I'm involved in a business that's helping to develop novel quantum materials, kind of various kind of frontier AI businesses. So I like things where there's some kind of frontier being explored by the founder. That's one thing I really love to kind of get involved in, because I just find it really makes me feel alive to be involved in those kind of companies. And the other thing is, missions with a very, kind of, that could make a very substantial contribution to tackling some of our sort of largest challenges. So climate is one area. I've been a very active angel investor, and I like businesses that could sort of potentially scale to, for example, removing a gigaton of carbon from the atmosphere, or transitioning some very hard to abate area of the economy to a sort of a clean form of energy, energy generation. So that's the sort of thing that I like. But usually the businesses that excite most VCs, unfortunately, are probably not the right business for me. I like stuff that's a bit more weird and frontier and maybe a bit more overlooked by sort of traditional investors. And in terms of how I like to get involved, I like to get involved really early on when everything's really messy and just help to figure it out. Spending quite a lot of time in the weeds with the founder and helping them kind of deal with all that mess and kind of clarify and simplify until we figure out what will really work.
Amazing. No, thanks so much, Ian. I also know another big emphasis for you at Plural is around diversity. I know you've invested in 29% female founders, 26% non-white founders, which is, these are great stats for an industry that's struggled with this historically. So can you share a bit more about your approach to DE&I and any advice you have for diverse founders listening to this that are currently raising capital?
So in terms of advice for diverse founders raising capital, I'd say, first of all, there are investors that are clearly prioritizing investing in a broader and more diverse set of founders, like Ada Ventures, Local Globe are doing great work here. And I think they're just trying to understand who as investors is really valuing kind of leveling the playing field for access to capital. The other general piece of advice for raising capital that applies here is just building relationships with other founders, peer-to-peer relationships with other founders alongside you in the journey. If I've invested in a founder that I really respect and trust, having worked with them for 5 years, and they refer me to a founder that they respect, who having worked alongside them as a peer, that's going to stand out. And the third thing I'd say is, in general, I think cold emails will get read. And the reality is there's a lot of them. And I think making the effort to write a cold email that really clearly understands why that person is the right fit for you. I mean, I'll get people cold emailing me saying, I'm building a SaaS company focused on KPIs for product management teams. And that could be a great startup, but it's totally and utterly not the kind of thing that I'm interested in investing at the moment. And so I think being very targeted, and if you're going to do cold emails, which does work, I've invested off the back of a cold email, I would say that you kind of need to just do the work to actually find an investor who clearly cares about your mission.
Great answer. And look, you referenced Czech Warner. She's been on the podcast. We've really, to your point around kind of, we want to get to a point where it's kind of equal representation. And we've certainly tried to sort of shine a light on voices that are speaking up for this in the venture ecosystem. We've had Czech, we've had Azechi Britton from ImpactX, And I think that there are a lot of people out there that are trying to do this. So yeah, any founders listening, do feel free to reach out. And I've got a list of investors in that space. We really are keen to try and help wherever we can. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on that, Ian. Before we let you go, I know that just looking at the slightly bigger picture, I know that you've got huge aspirations for Plural, and that involves having a much bigger macro impact across Europe. So what is your North Star for Plural, and how are you going to achieve that?
So the North Star starts with impact on a single company. So I'd like to take a company working on, let's create a sort of silly example, like a company trying to make the first viable working fusion reactor, right? Or a company trying to make a small nuclear reactor, fission reactor that is small and safe enough you can have one on every street corner. Something like that, a really, really hard, challenging problem. And I'd like to, by spending a day a week with that company and being deep in the weeds, increase the chance of success from like 1% to 20% by just both my time and energy going into the company, but also the collective experience of all the Plural unemployables. And if we can then scale that by scaling a sort of peer-to-peer network of these unemployable experienced founders, then in theory, we could actually have quite a large amount of impact on Europe as a whole. Because you do that for one company, then 2 companies, then 10 companies, you can actually impact the ecosystem. And the inspiration for that is Estonia. And Tarbit and Sten, 2 of my co-founders of Plural, they sort of told me that Estonia has a population of 1 million people, but they already have 7 unicorn startups, and startups have contributed 3% plus of GDP to Estonia. And a lot of that is basically boils down to the fact that Estonia was just a bit earlier in getting a really big hit in the form of Skype. And Skype then catalyzed the ecosystem to have more experienced engineers, more experienced product managers, more experienced marketeers, starting the next wave of companies. And so they were just kind of one level earlier in the ecosystem than, say, Paris or London or Berlin. And so our North Star is beyond individual company impact, is trying to have GDP impact on Europe, where we contribute to producing some truly world-class organizations that make a dent on challenges like climate or energy security or food security or the future of healthcare.
What an amazing North Star to have. And I'm sure there'll be lots of aspiring founders or early stage founders that will, I'm sure be really inspired by your words there, and hopefully can go on to build these category defining businesses across Europe. Before we get to our wrap up questions, is there any kind of final piece of advice for any leaders of and potentially high growth companies already about what they can do to play their part in this, and just why it's so important right now?
I think constantly trying to raise the ambition level for your organization and to really set the ambition as being the best in the world at what you're trying to do is kind of, I think, probably the core. I'm thinking in particular of a business called Helsing. And I was one of the first investors in this business. And it was founded in 2020 with the intention of, European kind of sovereign countries, democracies needed some kind of next generation defense technology rather than being reliant on American defense primes or Chinese defense primes. And my friend Torsten Rahl and I, we seeded the company with a view that, Trump was in power, America was a much less reliable partner on defense. And at the same time, you had sort of the rise of, very substantial sort of AI military companies in China. And so the company got started, and over time, Torsten actually decided to join the business as CEO. And I would say the biggest thing that Torsten did, in addition to raising the level of founder experience in the business, is just really raising the level of ambition and saying, right, we're going to really actually be the very best company in the world at this. And by doing so, we're going to fundamentally rewrite how European democracies think about defense. And obviously, this was before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But I think that the core kind of insight I really took from watching someone like Torsten is just raising the ambition level of what you're doing is an amazingly catalyzing effect, because it draws more talent, it draws more capital, and it draws more energy into the business.
Such an interesting answer. Thank you so much, Ian. And thank you for being such a fantastic guest. We are sadly at the end here. We've got 3 final questions that we'd just love to get your thoughts on as we wrap up. So in one sentence, what do you think the future holds for Plural?
Helping some really hard European missions succeed.
Awesome. And if you could be mentored by anyone, dead or alive, who would that be and why?
I'd choose Jerry Moffat to mentor me on my rock climbing.
Oh, amazing. Great answer. That's a first. And finally, what's the best advice you've ever received?
I mean, maybe it's my dad telling me to go for it with Songkick. Just kind of the encouragement to go for it.
Yeah, no, well, sometimes that's all you need, isn't it? It's a sort of gentle push in the right direction from someone that you you love and trust. Thank you so much, Ian. It's been a real privilege and a pleasure to chat to you. You've built an incredible business. You're now investing in amazing companies, and it's incredibly exciting to hear about your big ambitions for Plural. So we wish you all the very best. Thank you so much for joining us on 40 Minute Mentor today.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. I really hope that you found it useful and inspiring. If we have left any questions unanswered, or if you have any feedback or guest recommendations for future series, then please make sure you get in touch on info@jbmc.co.uk. I often get asked by listeners how you can help us spread the word about 40 Minute Mentor. There are two simple ways you can help. Firstly, share this episode on your preferred social media platform, and LinkedIn is probably where I'm most likely to see it. And you can also leave us a review on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Every share on social media and review left on the podcast platforms really helps us to get 40 Minute Mentor in front of new audiences and share the power of mentorship even further. Thank you so much for your ongoing support, and I look forward to seeing you again next Wednesday for even more pocket-sized mentorship.